they don't have to. We just have to do that ourselves.
Testing. This one's on. And I'm gonna leave it on right here.
So it's on and off on the top.
On and off here?
Yes.
Okay. That I can for sure have.
Okay,
And it's
you
on
got
now,
that one?
right?
Yeah, it's on. I'm gonna leave it on because you're close to Skype.
All right, sounds good.
One, two. 1, 2.
You got it? Say nothing. Testing, mic testing.
Testing, testing. There we go. You're first. You should mic up.
Okay.
I'm going to give you this mic after I welcome you.
Okay.
You can mic it while we're starting. Is that okay?
That's fine with me, yeah. He's right there. On stage?
Okay, how long are you in Chicago? Because you're based in Texas.
Yeah. I'm through Sunday. I've been here about a week and a half, so.
And what are your plans? You'll probably be at the opening on Thursday?
Yes, I'll definitely be there, but I'm here also to research for a new project on animal rescue and spirituality. So spirituality of rescuers and spiritual aspects of rescue and so all that kind of stuff. I'm just interviewing people. And so I've had, it's been a notebook this big, and this one is now 2/3 of the way.
Let me try. It's
Hello.
on. Oh, there you go. Now you're on.
Hello. Okay.
Shalom Aleichem. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you. Welcome to Chicago Theological Seminary. I'm Rabbi Rachel Mikva. I'm a professor here in Jewish studies and comparative studies and other stuff. And I also direct the Center for Jewish, Christian, and Islamic Studies, affectionately called JCIS because otherwise it takes too long to say any sentence involving the center. So JCIS supports educational programs. Can you hear me? Am I mic'd? I can't tell. Educational programs, interreligious engagement of diverse sorts, dialogue, social justice projects, etc. And it also directs a really interesting newish project called Eco-Community. Eco-Community is trying to, with a multi-faith cohort of students, examine the intersections of theological education, social justice, interreligious engagement, and a special focus on sustainability. But what we mean by sustainability is not simply a set of environmental questions, but all of those things that we need to think about in order to make sure that communities and those creatures who live inside them, human and otherwise, can thrive. So Eco-Community is sponsoring this program, and we wanted to share it with friends around the neighborhood and the city. It is also the second event of our Sukkot Shalom and Justice Week. If you came in the north side of the building, perhaps you saw our beautiful Sukkah. Sukkot is a Jewish harvest festival that celebrates the themes of Thanksgiving and hospitality, the sense of being under the care of the divine, and the interconnectedness of all things in the earth. So this theme, this evening, really evokes some of those intersectionalities in really beautiful ways. There's a custom in Sukkot of waving the lulav and etrog. It's these beautiful fruits and greeneries that decorate the Sukkot Shalom and Justice T-shirts. I didn't bring one to wave for you, but there is a custom of waving it in all directions during Sukkot. And it comes, I'm pretty sure, as one of those skeptical scholars, out of a set of pagan superstitions. And so I've never really been a big fan of waving the lulav. Oh, well, I could model. I can, well, but the Torah simply says to gather beautiful fruits. And so the rabbinic tradition has decided these are the ones to gather and set this custom of waving. But then this program came along. I'd heard of Gavin's work, and Gavin being the great partner that he is. Well, I'm working with all of these really interesting people on this project. Let's do something together. I suddenly have a new way to imagine waving the lulav. Right? Because one of the things that happens in thinking about the creatures with whom we share the city is most of the time we don't even notice. We're not paying attention. And that's one of the most dangerous things we do, is we just ignore important things that are very, very much all around us. So the custom of waving the lulav in all directions, which comes from some pagan something, also evokes for me now this spirit of paying attention to things that are all around us. This way, that way, this way, up and down. How to watch and pay attention. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn the program over to these wonderful folks and let them share their insights and their collective project and work with us and inspire us to see around us a little more clearly. I hope you got a program, because we're not going to introduce you and tell you all of the wonderful things they do. But in case you did not, I will grab a few and you can follow along then. So thank you very much. Thank you, Gavin.
Thank you. Wow, thank you, Rachel, for those beautiful words. And that does really resonate with the City Creatures Project. A big part about the project is making the city not only more inhabitable for other creatures, but more hospitable, welcoming them into our presence and finding ways to do that. So those words are really fitting. So I'm going to lay out the plan for you for tonight. Yep. You can eat. You go, yeah, go eat, yeah. I mean, you're handsome, and it's nice to have you up there, but.
Oh, you're going to bake cake, okay.
So here's the plan. My plan is to introduce the City Creatures Project. First, say a few words about story more generally that resonates between the realms of religion and nature. And then talk a little bit about the importance of animals and expanding our sense of place and care, especially in urban areas. And I will also read some short excerpts from a blog post that I did for the City Creatures blog that has some religion and animals themes in that intersection. I'll let the others talk about what they're going to talk about, but Dave will follow with a little bit more about animals and religion in general, and then focus on particular animals, religion in the city. And then Leah will introduce us to a mysterious opossum that she has encountered, I believe, and how that's led to other work that she's doing now. And Mike is going to talk a little bit about companion animals, particularly dogs, and the way that they can socialize us as human beings to one another. And I know from reading his essay in the book that he has a fantastic story and perspective on that. So I will begin at the beginning. A reading from the Gospel of being human in a more than human world. In the beginning was the story. Before the Word was the Word, before there were buildings, before there were high priests, before there were commandments, before there was writing itself, there was story. The rocks in the landscape, the creatures that dwelt nearby, the lights puncturing the vaulted dome of sky, the paths that connected them. These were the mnemonics of story, offering a living cartography of relationship. In the beginning was the story. Humans are storytellers, and they are also story dwellers. We live out our stories. Some of those stories we're born into, some we inherit from our families, our faith communities. Some are from history books or our local lore. We pass them down like recipes. They're the ingredients, at least we hope they are, of what constitutes a good life. We carry those stories and we live them out, sometimes unaware that we are doing so. And under the right set of circumstances, when tested and tempered by experience, those stories, even deeply rooted ones, can change. So what kinds of stories do we carry in our heads about the relationships between cities and nature? It's common enough to hear urban areas characterized as places of impersonal arrangements, places of mobility, economically driven, artificial, mechanical, industrial, places where care is diminished because people learn not to make eye contact, places to be afraid of unknown neighbors, maybe because of cultural dissimilarities, places where people are on the move, bound to the clock and a desk, where the almighty dollar has the first and final word. A city like that, images that we carry around in our heads of cities like that, tend to smudge any pretty pictures of nature that we might carry around with us as well. There's an artist that's contributed to, this is a little bit hard to see. If it's possible to dim the lights at all up here, that would be great. But there's an artist who's contributed to the City Creatures Project, Kira McGraw, and this is a map of Chicago that she did in ink. It's a little bit hard to see, so I'll explain it. And this is the before over here. There's a blank Chicago, and there's little flags that say pollution, smog, traffic. And then nature is, she grew up in the suburbs, is to the west. And there's a nature E lake to the east. So nature is not to be found in the city. The city is a blank spot on the map. And just like Kira, we have our own mental maps. Our stories draw the lines on those maps. They tell us what to expect, what's possible, and where nature can be found. So the question then becomes, how do we come to know and feel in our bones, really, that the city is alive? There could be a lot of ways, but the one that has been most apparent to me is by learning about the lives of other animals. The city is more than dead matter, more than lifeless space. And if you feel that way, then you probably have an animal to thank for showing you that. A new way to look at things, to see an ecological and a social web linked together, and maybe how your own life is knitted into that web as well. And then the second map that Kira drew just recently, and this will actually be featured at the Peggy Notebart Nature Museum, where an art exhibit related to the project opens this Saturday, is a populated map of Chicago. That she moved to Chicago, she's going to Columbia, and there's native plants in this picture now. There's the night sky, there's the lake ecology, but there's also the black-crowned night heron at the center of the picture. The black-crowned night heron is a remarkable animal that used to live on the southeast side of Chicago in Hemi Marsh regions, but recently moved not away from the city, but to the city, to the Lincoln Park Zoo, and is nesting now above the nature boardwalk, and apparently pooping on people's heads who walk underneath there. So some of you might be aware that Chicago has more biodiversity in its greater metropolitan area than rural Illinois, and that's largely because of corn and soy production, but it's also a remarkable testament to the kind of ecological work that goes on here, especially restoration work in the forest preserves and in the city itself. But for the City Creatures Project, we wanted to think about a restoration of Chicago. So one thing I think quite a bit about for my job at the Center for Humans and Nature is what past there might be for people to think about themselves as in relationship with the natural world, and how their role is critical and matters for the well-being of the places that we call home and Chicago. So that was the origin point of the City Creatures Project, which all of us who are speaking tonight contributed to. A major piece of that project has been the creation of a Chicago-based book of essays, poems, and artwork with now over 80 individual contributors. And all of those contributors approach this relationship with other animals through different artistic mediums. And I'm very pleased to say that this is being published by the University of Chicago Press, and it will be available in about 3 weeks, I think. Yes, 3 weeks. But you can pre-order it now, and I think there are some flyers for that, and I promise that that's the only shameless promotional plug that I'll do tonight. So pick up a flyer, though, discount. So here's the goal of the book, plain and simple. We wanted to offer an invitation to readers to see and then to interact differently with a living city. The book affirms the reality that the city is connected in every way across the landscape continuum. In the year 1800, only 3% of people lived in cities. 80% of us now live in cities in the United States and over 50% globally. It seems certain that cities will increasingly be the settings in which most human experience of non-human nature occurs. To be sure, Chicago's muddy stream embankments, overgrown housing lots, and abandoned fields threaded with bike trails aren't the jewels of any national park or wilderness area. But I would say that they are absolutely critical to developing our sense of connection to nature and a caring perspective. Without those places, we can't directly experience and thereby relate to and with other creatures. And as we learn to care where we are in our daily experiences, I would argue that our cities matter more than ever for how we think about all other places. Our everyday, ordinary experiences, sometimes a bus ride away, sometimes right out the back door, create unique opportunities. In some ways, those everyday experiences are the most important of all. So for better or worse, the city is not a place apart from nature. Cities, of course, are full of humans with diverse stories, languages, and cultures. They're also places of non-human movements, languages, and ways of being. These creatures carry their stories of migration and dwelling. City creatures can help us rethink what our responsibilities to nature are by reframing our ideas about where nature is and where nature can be. So I'd like to walk you briefly through the structure of the book because it speaks to this place-based experience. When we wanted to organize this book, we decided to organize it by the places we encounter other city creatures. So from the backyard to the bioregion is sometimes how I put it. The first section starts out in the backyard, places like our balconies, our gardens, those places that are closest to home in our domestic spheres of concern. Then we move on to neighborhood associations. The median strips in our neighborhoods, the parks in our neighborhoods, and the ways that those are connected and the creatures that we encounter there. The third section, Animals on Display, is about those places that oftentimes as children we have formative experiences in zoos, in aquaria, in nature museums. And then when we become adults, if we have our own children, we usually take them back there to have those experiences of animals that are from around the world oftentimes. The fourth section is Connecting Threads, and this is really about the greenways that sort of form a lattice work through the city. And that includes the forest preserves, but also those other informal trails that weave their ways throughout the city. The fifth section, we can't live right by Lake Michigan and not talk about water and all the many organisms that call Lake Michigan home. This section also includes the Chicago River, including the South Fork of the South Branch of the Chicago River, Bubbly Creek. Great essay about that in the book. So all the aquatic organisms that we share this city with. And then finally, the sixth section is a little bit more conceptual than the others in that it's really about what kinds of animals are adapting to urban areas, what kind of animals are moving back into the city and doing quite well, what kind of animals are migrating through, and then how do we come home to the city? How do we learn to see the city as a home, as a shared home? So stories can invite us to see these urban worlds with new eyes, feel the city in different ways, and respond to the needs of our co-inhabitants more fully. I've given you now a brief overview of the City Creatures book, and you'll hear my collaborators tonight, David, Leah, and Mike, speak a little bit more on that. So I want to mention just one last thing, and that's the City Creatures blog, which is online at the Center for Humans and Nature website. A new post is released every Monday, and submissions are open to all. So if you have submissions that you think fit the intersection of animals and the urban or built environment, then please just email me. There's also a blog submission form on the site. From the beginning of this project, we imagined that this weekly blog would make a wonderful complement to the book, which we knew would be a while before coming out in print. And so it enabled us to highlight these human-animal encounters from not just Chicago, but from around the country and sometimes from cities around the world. So to close out my portion of tonight's presentations, I'd like to give you, to read a little bit of a piece that I did for the City Creatures blog called The Volning Earth. And I chose this particular piece because it touches on the relationships between religion, animals, and ethics in a personal way for me. So I hope you enjoy it. Not long ago, I attended the ordination service of a former roommate and a longtime friend. The event was a formal way to confirm, with song and sermon and ritual, the call he had received to be a minister, and to acknowledge the hoops he had to jump through to get there. This being a Presbyterian service, there were numerous committees and subcommittees and probably even subcommittees that oversaw the labyrinthine process to ordination. After the service, a group converged for a celebratory dinner at a nice restaurant. Light conversation ensued. Do you have kids? Where do you work? At some point, I was asked from across the table what exactly I was doing. I mentioned the projects I lead for the Center for Humans and Nature, including one called City Creatures. Oh, an eyebrow arched. What is that exactly? We're looking at encounters in urban areas between humans and non-human animals, I replied, and how these connections can foster care for everyday nature where people live and work. I'm not sure anyone heard the latter part of the sentence. Conversation skidded to a stop. In my mind, I heard a needle scratch across the length of a record and drop with a hollow thud off the vinyl. Human and non-human animals. You know this feeling. The official term is party foul. Customary banter about where you live and how's your family, and then someone says the word orgasm, and despite not wanting to notice, some deep instinct arrests all other sounds, like a branch snapped in the woods, and both you and your conversation partner instinctually pause. Then you wait for a moment, just to see what happens next. Why did I introduce this unnecessary term, non-human? Is it unnecessary? I thought about this as I drove home from the dinner. Was I ungraciously trying to drive home a point that everyone should recognize and embrace a shared animality across species lines? I've become accustomed to the phrase non-human animal. The alternatives aren't attractive. In part, this is because to label someone an animal has become an invocation of baseness. He behaved like an animal, or a slur, you eat like an animal, or simply a dismissal. It's just an animal. Our language seems inadequate to the task of holding animal continuity and otherness in the same word. The people around the table that night probably didn't give much further thought to what I said. Likely it was forgotten when the dessert sampler arrived. But I did think about it. I thought back to the ordination service itself and wondered if anyone noticed the animals hovering around the edges of the service, scampering through the text and music. Take the biblical reading, a passage about Isaiah being chosen as God's prophet. Quote, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne. Above it stood seraphim. Each one had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. Then there were the hymns such as Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee. In the second verse, the congregation belted out all the works that contribute to God's glory. Field and forest, vale and mountain, flowery meadow, flashing sea, chanting bird, and flowing fountain call us to rejoice in me. I pondered how it is almost impossible to describe an invisible God without reference to a living earth and the animals that dwell upon it. I encountered an unusual and powerful reminder of this phenomenon in an Episcopalian church in Gainesville, Florida. At the front of the sanctuary above the altar, there was a wooden carving of a pelican enfolding her chicks with protective wings. I've noticed plenty of stained glass lambs and fishes in churches, but I couldn't recall ever seeing a pelican, especially one occupying such highly valued, iconic real estate. A little sleuthing was in order. The pelican sculpture resonates with verses in the book of Psalms in which God offers feathery protection under wing. But the more direct reference is to a common belief in the Middle Ages that pelicans fed their young with blood from their own breast, just as Jesus sacrificed his own body for his followers. In other words, a pelican Christ. I was surprised to discover that there's a very specific name to describe this act of pelican self-sacrifice, volning. When I later spoke to a woman who works at the church, she told me that the pelican mother with her chicks was a symbol of the Trinity. In other words, the mothering pelican represented divine interrelation, the encircling sacred. The volning pelican is a beautiful symbol, pointing toward mysteries beyond our ken. But I wonder, what about the mysteries with our kin? I mean here not animal carvings that represent the divine, but the actual presence of other animals with whom we share this earth. There's fairly widespread resistance to this kind of thinking, I know. I come out of a seminary background. I suspect the resistance is related to what caused the dinner party guests to balk at the phrase human and non-human animals. It wasn't simply unfamiliar terminology that prompted the discomfort, but the suggestion that humans are, yes, animals. We tend to see our species as uniquely unique, and our humanness is something that needs vigilant defense. This results in defining humans in opposition to other animals, with the gold standard being our cognitive capacities, our abilities to imagine, reason, and think about possible futures. So despite mounting evidence that our species holds no monopoly in the cognitive talent show, it still remains all too common to act as though humanness is next to godliness. In early October, I was fortunate enough to kayak on the Des Plaines River near McKinley Woods. White pelicans were migrating through northeastern Illinois at the time. Pelicans in the Midwest? That was new to me. And yet there they were, glorious foot-long, pumpkin-covered bills and all. I floated in silence as a faction of them unfolded their 9-foot-wide wings and hurled their bodies outward, slapping the water with their feet to gain necessary lift, then gliding upward on supportive currents of air. As I watched, an image flashed in my mind, the wooden sculpture in which God is depicted as a pelican feeding a brood of chicks. If a pelican sculpture can shed light on how to better understand our relationship to the sacred, actual pelicans allow us to marvel at a world full of non-human movements and consciousness, which is perhaps another way of saying how to better understand our relationship to the sacred. These pelicans are living kin, full of complexity, with a genome and a history related to our own, but with a morphology and a way of navigating through space that is vastly different. Reveling in the presence of pelicans is a splendor to be had in the here and now, not just the hereafter. And here they are, unmediated, at hand, and too far away to touch, familiar and mysteriously other, human and non-human. I wonder, would I describe the City Creatures Project differently if I had that dinner to do over? Probably not. I think my stubborn commitment to naming humans as animals has to do with my refusal to separate other species so that we elevate our own. That's a zero-sum game that leads nowhere. Nothing is just an animal. We all deserve more than that. Pelicans and other creatures may not care if we regard them as neighbors, but I would like to believe that there are benefits from actively choosing to do so. I relate, therefore I am. That's a communion worth exploring. Thank you.
Testing. Is it on? I'm on. Thank you. Good evening. Sorry you're missing the scene behind you as you're looking this way. This will come up later, so please ignore Louis until a bit later here. Before I begin, I want to say thank you also to the organizers. This has really been such a fun project, and I'm just delighted to get a chance to share a bit of it with you here tonight. So you may have noticed that when you talk with Dave or Gavin, it becomes clear that they are entirely convinced of the claim that encounters with city creatures have the power to change the way you live in the city. My living in the city includes teaching at a Lutheran seminary and directing the Zygon Center. So by extension, encounters with city creatures have the power to change the way I teach seminarians in the city. There's a sense in which everything that follows here is evidence or testimony to Dave and Gavin's deep conviction that everyday encounters with city creatures have the power to change the way we live in the city. For tonight, I'm going to try to share just two of the changes that are still in process in my own living and teaching, with a cough because of the change of season here, apologies, in process for my own living and teaching. And for the sake of time, I'm sticking with two, and I'm using a manuscript because there is so much to tell that if I go off script, we will be here all night, well past the glorious sunsetting that's happening behind us. So I'm going to begin with a story. This is the short excerpt from the piece that is in the City Creatures volume that describes this encounter with an opossum. It was actually just before twilight. I'm having strange sort of deja vu on that feature here. It was just before twilight, and it was an early spring afternoon. And a very awkward something passed by the sliding glass doors that look out onto our postage stamp-sized yard. The something that passed by our doors did not escape the notice of my young son, and it elicited one of my very favorite questions from him. What is that? So our little coach house actually sits just over there, here in the neighborhood on the south side, and it sits along an alleyway. And that alleyway and the yard are really major thoroughfares for the resident feral cats and squirrels that live there. And many times a week, my son and I would be playing and building towers with wooden blocks to realize that our playtime had become a spectator sport for some furry feline friend. But on this particular morning, something about the fur and the gait was different, and my son was curious. What was that? He asked again. So with that question hanging in the air, we ran to the window and pressed our noses to the glass, and we looked. Now, the tail was distinctly rat-like, and I think probably because of the noise of our hands and noses pressed up against the window, the creature turned and peered back at us. He looked at us with these beady little black eyes, and we caught a glimpse of that pointy snout, the mouthful of teeth, dirty fur, and, well, it wasn't really actually dirty. It's dirty-looking fur. Possums have this very cool undercoat. And again, we saw this rat-like tail. So now standing really hand to paw with this creature on the other side of the glass, my son asked, "Mama, what is that?" And with surprise, I said, "Why, it's an opossum." To which my son said, "What's an opossum?" So I grew up in a very small town in northern Illinois. My hometown still does not have any stoplights. After school, I played on a farm, and we had cows and pigs and farm cats that were our after-school mates. We drove on dark gravel roads, and we were much more likely on those roads to meet a deer or a raccoon than another car. In that landscape, opossum encounters were still rare, but they weren't really all that out of the ordinary. Growing up in the city, however, my son is exposed to a variety of animals: dogs in the parks, cats in the alleys, squirrels and pigeons and crows and sparrows on walks, farm animals and dinosaurs, an interesting combination, right? But in books, and then wild animals in zoos. It's really a challenge for him to get to know our neighbors, animal or otherwise. if the neighbor in question is a creature like the opossum, city kids like my son aren't really likely to encounter them at all. After all, the Virginia opossum doesn't really rank very highly in the cultural imagination. It's the kangaroos and koalas and wombats that get all the attention in the marsupial order. So consistently, when I have told folks about this encounter with the opossum, I get one of two reactions. You saw what? Is the first one. And the second one is, oh, yeah, I know a guy that can help you get rid of that. As a city creature, opossums are, as we have talked, usually invisible or unwanted. And this really seems to me the trouble with some of our city creatures. Unfortunately, nature in the city is often unseen. And the thing I have come to hear from this opossum is that occasionally when it is seen, it's unwelcome. So my first shift really in my teaching after this encounter with the opossum, maybe in conjunction with the encounter with the opossum, was the naming of this fact that our urban nature encounters are sometimes uninvited and unwelcome and unseen. So I urged my students to see urban nature, to be open to it as a place of God's creative action. So here's what we did. I'm going to steal that suggestion to go sit. I'm going to steal that one for sure. What we did was I have always had my students do these theological sightings. Theological sightings in my theology classes come under two kinds of options. A theological sighting can be a sighting of public theology. This is the things like when you see sinful chocolate cake on a menu, that sort of thing. So theology kind of in unexpected places, you can use that as a theological sighting, which I always expect students to take that option, but rarely they do. Usually they take the second option, and the second option is to share a sighting of God at work and to do some theological reflection that connects what you've seen with the topic at hand. Now, when we would learn together about the theme of creation, students would bring back lovely theological sightings from Yellowstone National Park, from the Boundary Waters, from Superior National Forest, if we were lucky, from Indiana Dunes. But students really seemed unable to bring that vision of the city. So I asked them to be vigilant for sightings of the sacred in the city, and especially in urban nature. And very slowly, we started to get some glimpses. What we saw were prairie restoration projects that were on the lakefront that became this metaphor for the blessed community, right? It could model this give and take of ecological and social communities that were rooted, diverse, welcoming, discerning, and an expression of the sacred. Another lovely one was the sighting of migratory birds that could teach us spiritual lessons about the importance of journey and trust and safe havens and the meaning of home. However, this opossum still haunted me, as does this exhortation that I have since read about ecological activism for a public church. So in 2012, there's an article in the journal, for the study of religion, nature, and culture, where Michael Immergut and Laurel Kearns share a comment from an activist. It's a denominational activist who's working at the national level. And they say, there are three kinds of ecological activists: the stargazers, the tree huggers, and the rats and the roaches. That's where the churches belong, caring for those for whom nature is often no more than rats and roaches, and for the people treated as such. And I think here, for me, is really where the work continues. My opening up to this opossum means that it's not enough to stay with the prairie restorations and the migratory birds. How can we be open further to see the sacred in the opossum and the rats and the roaches? So this is the context for this second change that is still in process for my living and teaching. My current project that really has been spawned by this work with the opossum and the City Creatures Project investigates the possibility for bringing in theological resources as lenses to help us see and welcome city creatures like opossums, rats, and roaches. So I think the best way that I can explain what I'm after here is through an analogy. And I'm going to use this short clip from a TED Talk And there's a whole pedagogy of using TED Talks that I would be happy to talk about later, but we're just going to use Mr. Schwarzenberg's lovely TED Talk from March, where he's sharing this film called The Mysteries of the Unseen World. So we're just going to do a short, it's just about 2 minutes, a short 2-minute clip here. And what he does is use technology to reveal things that are present but invisible, because we humans are too big and too slow and too fast and too small all at the same time to see them. So we're going to take just 2 minutes to use this as an analogy for the kind of thing that I'm working on now.
There is movement which is too slow for our eyes to detect. And time-lapse makes us discover and broaden our perspective of life. We can see how organisms emerge and grow. How a vine survives by creeping from the forest floor to look at the sunlight. And on the grand scale, time-lapse allows us to see our planet in motion. We can view not only the vast sweep of nature, but the restless movement of humanity. Each streaking dot represents a passenger plane, and by turning air traffic data into time-lapse imagery, we can see something that's above us constantly but invisible: the vast network of air travel over the United States. We can do the same thing with ships at sea. We can turn data into a time-lapse view of a global economy in motion. And decades of data give us a view of our entire planet as a single organism, sustained by currents circulating throughout the oceans and by clouds swirling through the atmosphere, pulsing with lightning, crowned by the aurora borealis. It may be the ultimate time-lapse image. The anatomy of Earth brought to life. At the other extreme, there are things that move too fast.
There's a lot more good footage here, so I highly recommend the rest of it. It's a short video here. It's lovely, no? It's just lovely. It takes us kind of the global scale, even while we're thinking and sitting here in Chicago, the way that we're connected. But the thing that I think is so helpful as an analogy is that the way he is using technology to help us see what we can't see, right? The idea for me is that theological resources from our various traditions can do that same work, that they can really start to provide us with lenses that can help us see the unseen and sometimes the unwanted, right? The unwelcomed, and find ways to invite in. So that's the analogy that I'm after here. This encounter with the opossum and the responses that came afterwards have really planted this hypothesis that city creatures are often unseen because we humans have too narrow a view of nature, and that there are theological resources that might act as lenses to reveal these creatures and to evoke a response of welcome and connection. Theology, like technology, can help us see and welcome what has previously been unseen or exterminated. So in particular, I'm looking at ideas like Rudolf Otto's Mysterium Tremendum and Fascinans. It's the ways in which the holy is encountered in ambiguous places of fear and fascination. And I'm looking at sacramental theologies that envision places for sacred relations between the finite and the infinite. So the goal here really is to marshal these theological resources in support of a kind of urban nature-assisted spirituality. As I was working on the presentation for you to share tonight, I was forwarded a column by an LSTC alumni. Her name is Emily Carson. She writes for the Rochester, Minnesota Post Bulletin. She goes under the name Lady Pastor. And she was, the blog post comes as she's waiting in a hospital receiving room for outpatient treatments. And she found herself in this room that had a history of pigeon encounters. And she has this lovely excerpt that describes her time there. She says she sat down in a chair and felt compelled to press her face to the glass. The width of the window pane was all that separated us. It's hard to describe what it was about the bird that I found so enchanting. His strange orange eyes or drabby gray feathers. No, not really. Instead, in those moments, it was the way that seeing that bird arose in me a sensation of the connectedness of all things, a kind of peace and trust that came up unexpectedly. You could say it was on a wing in a prayer, but I hadn't even prayed that day, so I guess it was just on a wing, a pigeon wing. There are creation encounters that propel us outside ourselves, that provide a deep, pervasive calm. Perhaps you can think of some. Looking at a sky full of stars, sitting on an ocean beach, seeing a moose for the first time. And now, she says, to my list, I'll add, closely observing a pigeon. God's presence is mysterious. So I would love to be able to claim that this is a direct outcome of my teaching. Our assessment task force would love for me to be able to claim that as well, but she graduated before I was able to implement the city creature-inspired changes to my pedagogy. But that said, I think this is an example and a hope for the direction of future teaching. So I expect that it's clear that working on the City Creatures project has convinced me, I don't know if I want to say converted, but has convinced me of Dave and Gavin's original conviction that encounters with city creatures have a power to change the way we live in the city. For me, it's really been a remarkable turning point in my own living, teaching, and researching. And happily, this presentation gives me a chance to publicly say thank you for creating a deadline that forced me to be open to the opossum. So thank you for that. But I want to close with an echo to the invitation that was issued as part of the book's kind of credo. And that invitation is to be open and stay open to these city creatures. And in that, my hope is that the opossums and the rats and the roaches and the pigeons will find you. And when they do, that you'll be waiting and open to receiving them. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to add my thanks to all of you for hosting us here at Chicago Theological Seminary, and also to Dave and Gavin for the original invitation to participate in this project along with Leah. It has certainly been a lot of fun for me, and it's shaped the way I think about my scholarship and my teaching for sure. My project in the book was really an opportunity to share a very personal story about a relationship with a dog and how this dog brought me into relationship with some special people. And it also provided an opportunity to explore a political hunch that I had, that our preferences for certain kinds of companion animals reflected certain kinds of political dispositions. And really that was more of a kind of playful prejudice that I had, being a dog person rather than a cat person, that I wanted to see what I could do with. So the hunch was that somehow, cats are for libertarians. And they want to be left alone, right? They want their own little space, left alone. Dogs are very social creatures, and so dog folks lean left democratic. That's the idea. And I just wanted to play with the idea, and I learned a great deal. I knew nothing about any of this before, and that was so it's certainly the case that by being asked to think and reflect about an animal encounter that I've had in the city, it opened up a whole new world of understanding for me. So this is the story I want to tell. It's sometimes been said that the solution to the problems of democracy is more democracy. But what if the way to more democracy is more and better dog companioning and dog parks? I mean, think about it. Companioning dogs forces us to get out of our homes and involved in our neighborhoods. Caring for dogs entails learning to be empathic, learning to sense and respond to another's needs. And getting out, getting involved, and learning to be more empathic are critical democratic practices. And so in these ways, dog companioning and dog parks, which create unique urban, civic, and associational spaces by bringing diverse people into relationship, can contribute to the repair and the deepening of democracy. So, there have been many dogs in my life, but no dog had as much of an impact on my life as Birch. When I first met Birch in 1999, I was a graduate student here at the U of C at the Divinity School, and I was in a very difficult marriage. Though my partner was definitely not a dog person, I eventually talked her into rescuing a greyhound. After a couple of trips from Chicago out to a rescue agency in southern Wisconsin, I brought Birch to her new home in Hyde Park. She was gangly, she was golden, and she was a neurotic dog. She had been mistreated by her handlers during her brief racing career, but eventually she warmed up to me and began to trust me. We bonded on long walks through the neighborhood, through the campus, and along the lakefront. About a year later, we had a baby boy, and since babies demand a lot of attention, my daily habits with Birch changed. We didn't go out for walks nearly as often, and Birch became depressed. Between parenting, working, and studying, it became harder for me to give Birch the time and affection she needed and deserved. And on top of this, my wife never liked Birch and clearly wanted her gone. So after a lot of anguished reflection, I decided I needed to return Birch to the rescue agency with the hope that she could be provided with a better family. It was a very difficult decision, since I felt that returning Birch would wound her already fragile spirit. The trip back up to Wisconsin was miserable. I had my son with me, and Birch, as usual, was throwing up in the back seat. When we finally arrived, the woman from the rescue agency scolded me, as she was right to do. I was ashamed. I knew I was hurting this dog. She had known almost nothing but rejection in her life. But at the time, I was trying to do everything I could to make for a more peaceful marriage. Well, in spite of that, the marriage didn't last much longer. About a year and a half after my divorce, I was adjunct teaching. At the end of the class, I offered to write a positive recommendation for one of the standout students if she ever decided to go to graduate school. Well, 6 or 7 months later, just after I finished my dissertation, I received an email. I couldn't place the name at first, but she told me she decided to go to grad school and that she wanted to take me up on that offer to write a recommendation. But since she'd only taken one class from me, I suggested we should meet so I could learn more about what she wanted to do and why. So a few days later, I met this student, Sarah, near my office, and we went out for coffee. We talked about her plans for an hour or so, and then she told me about her family and her dog, a greyhound that she and her mom had rescued a few years back. She told me how neurotic and this dog was, and hadn't barked for years, but she found her voice and loved to bark with the other dogs in the neighborhood. Then she told me again how neurotic she was. So my curiosity was piqued. I told Sarah that I had once rescued a greyhound, but had to return her for some unfortunate family reasons. I asked which rescue agency she had used, and she told me they had picked the dog up in Wisconsin. The folks at the agency told them the dog had been previously adopted, but that the family who adopted her had to return her. So I asked her about her dog's coloring, and she said, well, she's golden. I asked her how long ago they adopted her. She said it had been about 4 years or so. I asked her what her dog's name was, and she said Birch. I'm not kidding. Birch me. I mean, what a come-on line, right? I mean, so who would believe that? But when she began to test me with some really specific questions about Birch and I could answer, then she was convinced, and we were speechless. Well, a few days later, I went out to Sarah's house to visit the dog, Birch, and it truly seemed to me as if she remembered me in a way from years before. Though normally she was very shy around new people, she greeted me with a couple of and as if kind of offering her forgiveness and allowed me to pet her. One thing led to another, and Sarah and I got married. And we rather quickly formed a pack. In addition to my boy, we now have 2 young daughters and 2 rescued shelters. So this uncanny sequence of events, I was given a second chance to love Birch. Birch gave me a second chance to love. She lived for more years, long enough for my boy and for my oldest daughter also to love her. The love, the loss, and the love again for Birch have been the wages of my adult life as husband, father, and lover again. Birch's innocent, her wounded, and healing soul remembered the wounded and wounding animal in me. In loving and being loved by Birch, I've learned how spaces can be between failure and forgiveness, commonality, and difference. So this is the personal story I had to tell. I wanted to share it. And it led me into a whole new area of understanding for me, some of which has already been referenced. So as unlikely as my story about Birch may seem, the reality is that dogs have been bringing people together for millennia. In evolutionary terms, the domestication of dogs has had much to do not only with the state of humans, but also with the birth of cities, and thus also with the origins of politics. The direct biological descendants of wolves, dogs branched into their own species between 15 and 35,000 years ago, and the dates are unsettled. Some scientists put this way back way further. And Dave and Gavin probably know better than I do. The point is, a long time ago, okay? And across these many millennia, humans and dogs have worked together in diverse ways. Dogs have provided us with security. They've helped us to hunt, to track, and to herd, and they've helped us to carry and pull. In these ways and others, dogs freed our early ancestors from certain tasks and allowed them to pursue others. Human-dog relations thus contributed to human role specialization and consequently the division of labor, which made it possible for early human groups to grow in complexity and productivity. Increased productivity led to surplus resources, which made the transition from nomadic foraging to place-based settlement possible. Place-based settlement gave rise to more sophisticated services, to innovations in governance, and eventually to human cities. So all this is to say, interspecies social bond between humans and dogs, preceded by a few millennia, the development of intraspecies social bonding among humans in cities. So it may be distinct from primates, but humans and canids have co-evolved. So what does any of this have to do with democracy, which was the other part of the story I wanted to explore? Well, if the city is racially divided and unequal as Chicago, and thus in great need of more and better democracy, it would be wise for us to remember the depths of our shared history with dogs. In about, I have to say too that a couple were this part I'm going to share about is actually right. I'm not sure which direction I'm facing, but it's right nearby. Okay, it's like 61st and so just a couple blocks away. Okay. So in about 2006, Sarah and I, my son, and our dogs moved into a condominium in Woodlawn. 2 other young couples in our building also had dogs, and we all started running into each other at an empty lot, across the street. As the dogs chased each other in their way, we humans also got one another. And it didn't take long for a bunch of other folks to start showing up from my place. We were black and white and brown, working and professional class, employed and unemployed, religious. We were professors, computer programmers, striving artists, musicians, and perpetual grad students. We were youngish and oldish. We were going through qualifying exams and enduring tenure review anxiety. And the dog park became for us a kind of axis mundi, a strong center in our otherwise spinning, disconnected worlds. It provided a place of friendship in the midst of a larger world that many of us were experiencing as frenetic, chaotic, and unpredictable. If not for our dogs and the dog park, we would likely never have met one another. But because caring for our dogs led us out of our private spaces into the public, and because the dog park became a civic site, we not only got to know one another, we got engaged in neighborhood issues. Now, none of this was revolutionary, at least not on a large scale, but one could say that a number of micro-revolutions were launched, a changed mind here, an opened mind there, a relationship born here, a neighborhood that became a little more neighborly. And in these ways, the dogs and the dog park helped us to relearn the arts of civic friendship, and therefore to contribute, even if in a small way, to the renewal of democracy. This is Elmo and Grover, who are now in Colorado. This is Molly with the tennis ball, and I'm not sure who the other dog is. This is Flora. This is Riley. And who am I missing? Ozzy's over here, sweet Ozzy. And these are, maybe this might be Ozzy too. Molly at the beach. Okay, so these are some of the dogs. Some members of the dog park group moved away from Woodlawn, but some of us stay connected, and we meet every so often to share a meal and to tell our various dog tales. And in this way, our dogs in the dog park graced us with something very fundamental. After all, in a big city, it's easy to be anonymous. It's too easy for our human worlds, and it's therefore too easy to ignore the animality we share with other creatures. Our dogs in the park brought us out of our isolation and into a sense of mutual creature belonging, into a little city within the larger city, Canis lupus familiaris. And so, as we have been doing for millennia, Elmo and Grover, Flora and Preston, Molly, Ozzy, Riley, Stella, and the rest of the pack helped us to rediscover our own nature as city creatures, and thereby to know ourselves as a little more fully human. Yet.
So we have just a few minutes for questions. Perhaps I can invite the four of you to come up. We'll turn on some lights.
Should work.
Because it wasn't working for you.
Oh, it wasn't?
Okay, test it.
Hello? Hello, hello?
So now you can
Hello?
take a moment and I'll actually
Hello, hello, test, test.
see if you did what I was talking about in terms of the evening as it falls on the city. There's a blessing in
Hello, hello, hello.
the evening prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Elohim Elohim. Blessed are you, the Holy One who draws us all together, who brings on the evening.
Test.
But it's sure it's written for evening's evening. And it's not very, it doesn't sound very good. But it's here it sounds very beautiful. And
Hello?
but it is the way in which our actions become things, right? The verbs and the nouns interrelate. And so perhaps we can, we have all four of them, think about some questions or would like to ask them to reflect on and connect some of these meditations to actions in the city that we might consider, or other questions. All right. Anybody?
Testing.
Interpersonally might be able to extend the impact of the kind of thinking that you're talking about. And the consciousness of our friends and neighbors. What might we be doing in the city to make change?
There's so many ways to answer that. Yeah, it's a really big question. I mean, because you can start, I mean, how do you convince anybody of anything? I mean, that's, you know, I think we share our stories, and we know people, whether it's through common social bonds or community activities, or that we see each other in the same places. And you know, I don't think people ever respond to convince, you know, like trying to somebody, this animal is important, why don't you, you know, if they're not starting in that position, they're not going to be able to clearly see that. So really it starts with our own interpersonal relationships with other people, and then can proceed from there. At least that's what I'd say. I'd be interested in hearing others' thoughts.
I'll just throw something out real quick in terms of the first part of the question. So I'm convinced increasingly, and this is kind of an awkward and a difficult thing for, you know, an intellectual type to say, and especially somebody that's trained in argument and interpretation and this sort of thing, but that reason has just about nothing to do with it. And so I don't think that it's you know, in other words, consciousness, just addressing consciousness and shaping beliefs and knowledge is really not how behavior is changed. And this is one of the things, in fact, that I think we're learning increasingly through cognitive and neuroaffective sciences and through the encounter with animal minds, how little reason has to do with coming to positions, ideas, and values, and instead how reason is used retroactively to justify beliefs, values that we already have. And so the way to change is not to really it's not head on, but it's through different practices. And different practices, different ways of being in relationship with people, and different practices and relationships can be connected to different kinds of association, different kinds of civic settings, for example. And so the dog parks, getting involved with the dog park, for me, I'd always been a dog person, but it awakened me to a whole level of understanding and interest in animals in the city that I hadn't otherwise had. So one of the things that I discovered, I mean, we talk about Chicago, for example, as a city of sides, right? south side, north side, west side, and how racially and economically divided it is. And that shows up in terms of dog amenities. So all the formal dog amenities really are on the north side. And there are very few formal dog amenities on the south side. 0. And so the dog park that I was talking about it was guerrilla dog parking, right? We went and claimed a space. So I guess the point is that by getting into relationship with different kinds of folks, starting to do different kinds of things, that's what changed behavior for me. More specifically, I think there are probably lots of other things that could be done in the city. There's a canine club in Chicago, for example. I think Dave and Gavin and Leah probably know more than I do about specific outlets for activity. But the point is about the change. I think the changing of consciousness and values comes through changing behavior and relationship.
And I'll just add one more sort of idealistic, I think, practical/idealistic space that I can't but keep hearing. And in a way, it's to say, well, the grown-ups, what do we do for the kids, right? Kids, they don't have those hang-ups. Like if you set a kid out in a lot, they are going to find it. I have a 6-year-old and a 2-year-old, and they see nature in the city and care a whole lot about it. And there are, I think, a lot of kids that could use more time spent with folks who also care about it, that could really nurture that. I know in the National Teachers Academy that my son goes to, is Chicago Public School, there's a small community garden. They need volunteers. That's true across the city. Sneaky, right? Like the change in little people who are going to then make the change on the road. I think there's a way to do that kind of consciousness changing, shaping, nurturing for those little folks. I'm delighted to see one in the corner. That I think really there's something to be had there.
I want to follow up on this comment there. I think direct experience of nature somehow we ourselves and then have to get away from our computers and our phones and get outside. Chicago Wilderness has a program called No Child Left Inside, and they're trying to do literally, right? They're trying to do what Leah's talking about, our kids outside. Like when I was a kid, my friend and I played in these nearby our houses. Well, those woods are developed now, right? So we have to help kids ourselves have these experiences. So direct experience is one. And I want to tell you about a few other programs that I've been learning about since I've been back in Chicago. One is Safe Humane Chicago. It's a program that takes dogs into public schools, particularly in low-income areas, where exposure to dogs can often be negative. It might be dog fighting, it might be stray dogs on the street that you're not sure if you can actually pet them, but they take trained dogs into the school and show the kids how to interact with them safely. Approach a dog or not approach a dog, when do you not approach a dog, right? So that's a program that I think is really neat. Another program called Sit, Stay, Read, right? So how do we get kids to read, especially if they're having trouble? They're embarrassed. They're blind. When you were a kid, maybe they made you, everybody's reading out loud. If you don't read as fast as everybody else, you're embarrassed in front of the whole classroom. But dogs are good at they don't judge. Right? They're going to wag their tail and smile at you whether you're reading or not. They just don't care. So they bring dogs into the public schools and have them help the kids learn to read. But guess what? They're also learning to love dogs. Right? So programs like that, I think, can make a real difference.
Thank you. I've really appreciated each of your sharing your personal narratives of human and non-human animal relations. My name is Kristen Konakala. I'm an alumna of the master's program at Chicago Divinity School. And I've lived here some 6 years and had numerous encounters with non-human animals, especially about your
sorry, there's a vegetal turn underway, I think. There is, for real. Plant Thinking is a new book in philosophy. This is absolutely part, maybe it was triggered by the animal turn or whatever, but there's a real opening to learning across.
Yeah, and there are a lot of plant-focused people in the Chicago area, especially with prairie restoration and the kind of work that goes on there. I think people botanizing, like in a way, like people who I guess would be considered amateurs because they're not scientists, nevertheless having just encyclopedic knowledge of, prairie plants, but not just the plants themselves, but what makes the community tick. How everything works together, and for me, that's when all these relationships, the important connection between things. It's not that I'm not a plant person, speaking personally, but when you see what pollinates what animals, voles that feed on, the roots of prairie plants, and the way that everything is connected is an exciting way, no matter if you're coming at it through plants or animals or the water or whatever it might be. I think those larger connections and threads of connection between things are what are really exciting. So we can focus on individual animals, but ultimately, I think we're all sort of pushing for the larger sense of connection. It's been mentioned a number of times tonight. It made me have a larger sense of self, of being connected, or even transcending my own individual identity. So I think that figures into it as well. Oh, and I will say one thing about animals. The reason that I think we're both, I don't know, I won't speak for Dave, I'll let him speak. But I think the reason that animals are an easier access point for a lot of people, and this is going to be maybe a strange way to put it, but animals have faces. And we connect to things as human beings with eyes. We connect to things with faces. We can read emotions. We're trained. We don't have to be trained to read other people's emotions usually by the facial signals that they give, which is a large reason that dogs and human beings, or that wolves and human beings were able to have a kind of interspecies communication that was intelligible behaviors between our two species. So I think that's an easier, pardon the sell, for people to latch onto more quickly. It's a little bit harder for people that aren't automatically born plant people.
I would say whatever connects you to nature is great. I had a good friend who, she loved animals, she wrote about them, but she said my totem is birch. Right? It was she really fell in love with. And there's a lot to trees, right? They connect, if you want to talk spiritually, they connect the upper world, they connect this world, they connect whatever's below. So I would say whatever brings you awe and wonder and fear, right? These are the things that we ought to focus on. And whether they're plants or animals or Lake Michigan or the wind, a lot of my students write about the wind a lot. So I'd say anything that gets you in touch is good.